One of the things that drives conservatives crazy is that even when we win, we lose. Even when we get majorities, the culture keeps going in the direction we've been talking about today, this direction really, which is now bordering on genuine wickedness. Yoram Hazony has written this incredibly exciting book called Conservatism, a Rediscovery. He is the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, the president of the Herzl Institute, the leading proponent of the National Conservative Movement, which is reinvigorating the American and European right. Yoram, thank you so much for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Andrew. Really a pleasure to be here.
So you start in this book with a historical thesis, basically, that things changed after the world wars. Can you explain how that happened?
Sure. It used to be that if you go back, as many centuries as you want, almost in English and American history, Anglo-American history, it used to be that there were two clear positions. People knew who the liberals were, and people knew who the conservatives were, and some thought that was a healthy tension. Some thought it was a terrible tension. But the liberals were people who were primarily about individual liberties and equality, and the conservatives were people who thought differently about the world. What was principally of interest to them, not that they didn't care about liberty, but was principally of interest to conservatives, was the question of conservation and transmission. What do you need to do? How do you need to build your society? How do you need to build your country if you want anything? Ideas, institutions, behaviors to be transmitted over many generations. And those are two different philosophies with two different positions. In America, the fight between liberals and conservatives kind of comes to an end after the Second World War. The two world wars are a big trauma. We could discuss exactly why, but many Americans came and Europeans came out of the two world wars saying, never again. We've just got to once and for all defeat the injustice that characterized mankind up until now, and we're just gonna do it. And by the 1960s, they had imposed a new regime, which was eventually called liberal democracy, where instead of having these two parties, liberal and conservative, competing with one another, both sides came out being different kinds of liberals. And that hasn't worked so well. I mean, it worked in solving certain particular crying injustices like the persecution of blacks in America. But overall, it brought us to the Cultural Revolution that we're watching today.
So, I mean, one of the things that you say that my heart sank a little bit, because I frequently say I'm a conservative because I'm a liberal, because at least American, I mean, I think there's a difference between British and American conservatism, that Americans have that written constitution that we're defending. We kind of know what we're trying to conserve, the ideas that went into that. Edmund Burke, I'm a huge fan of Burke, but there's a certain kind of feel of tradition, hierarchy, the things that, as you say, want to be passed on.
Right.
Why am I wrong to say that I'm a conservative because I'm a liberal? What is the problem there?
Well, the problem is that during the 1940s and 1950s, American intellectuals and politicians and Brits too worked really hard to sort of erase the history of conservatism. But Burke is mentioned occasionally as though he invented it, which is ridiculous, because how can he be the inventor of a tradition that's 700 years old at the time that he was defending? But there are all these prominent people who, after World War II, said, look, America's always been liberal since the founding. And the same thing happened in Britain, that people started saying, ever since the Glorious Revolution, Britain has been liberal. And both of those things are false. And basically what's happening is that the universities and people who study in universities are perpetuating a myth. It's really propaganda, claiming that there never was a conservative tradition in America. Now, if I go some in the book, I go into this in some detail. If you look at the extremely deep and bitter divide between the American Federalist Party, that was basically the nationalist conservatives of those days. We're talking about Washington, Hamilton, Adams, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris. These are the people who wrote the American Constitution, and the claim that whole party of nationalist conservatives was not important, and actually everybody in the founding were just liberals. Basically what it does is it replaces George Washington as the father of America, replaces him with Jefferson, who really was a liberal. And look, I don't blame anybody for thinking these things, because this is what you're taught at university. But if you look this stuff up, it's not so hard to see that there was a real contest between liberals and conservatives at the American founding, and that the Constitution is actually a conservative document, going back to the English Constitution, imitating it rather than what the liberals wanted.
Okay, Roger Scruton wrote this book about conservatism, where he ended up saying basically conservatism is always just a reaction to things, and really has no content except to fight back. What is it about the Constitution that makes it a conservative document?
Well, I have tremendous respect for Sir Roger. We were friends, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. But we didn't agree about absolutely everything. And
I'm a big fan of his too, by the way. But
I'm a tremendous. I mean, the man is simply a hero and a true conservative, but not a historian, an excellent philosopher. But I think that he gets some of the history a little bit wrong. And the thing to be looking at is here. I think the best way to think about it is this: most of the things that many of the things that are good about the American Constitution, as John Adams and Hamilton and others said, are imitations. They're directly inherited from the English Constitution. And the way you can tell this is true is if you go back a few centuries earlier, go back to like John Fortescue, the great common lawyer. He's already writing in the 1470s. Now, I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but just read the book. It's really easy to read. There's a new edition out. It's really easy. The English is easy. 1470s, Sir John Fortescue is saying, what's great about England? It's the freest nation on earth. Why? Because of our traditional constitution. He's saying this in the 1470s. And there he already is explicitly talking about what we call the separation of powers, the balance between competing branches of government, the foundational place of property. He writes about how in Britain, unlike in France or Germany, the king has no right to enter the home of even the poorest farmer, and to take anything from him. He can't even step into the house without the permission of the farmer. Now, all of these things, and the jury trial, and the role of the legislature in terms of of the parliament in terms of passing legislation and approving taxation. Every one of these things and many others are described in the 1470s by Fortescue in his book In Praise of the Laws of England. Now, those things are not explicitly discussed in the American Declaration of Independence. They're not explicitly discussed in the first American Constitution of 1777. The Articles, today we call it the Articles of the Confederation, but it was basically the liberal Constitution. And Americans tried that for 10 years, and they almost lost the Revolutionary War because of it. They didn't have the power to tax. They didn't have the power to raise money for soldiers. They didn't have the power to conscript. They didn't even have the power to make peace and enforce it. Washington and his officers and his supporters began already during the war saying, this is impossible. We need to go back to something like the English Constitution. So that the Constitution of 1787 is a restoration of much of what John Fortescue says 300 years earlier is the great tradition of the English Constitution. Now, there are other things that they're conserving. They're conserving Christian religion. They're conserving the common law tradition. They're conserving the English language and its great word. There's all sorts of things being conserved. But the important thing to understand is that just because you support separation of a balance of competing powers within the Constitution, or property rights, or the jury trial, these things don't make you a liberal. Those things make you an Anglo-American conservative. To be a liberal is to say, we don't need tradition anymore. We don't need the Christian religion. We don't need the common law. We don't need the English language. What we can do is we can just purify a few of these key points we got from the conservatives and claim that they're not English. They're universal. They apply to everybody, and they're a dictate of pure human reason. So then you're a liberal, because you've thrown religion aside. You've thrown national tradition aside. And that happened after World War II. It lasted exactly 2 generations. And now we're on the brink of just watching the entire American experiment collapse, because the liberals took this propaganda line and essentially said, look, we don't need conservatism.
So now, all right, so the content of conservatism includes Christianity, includes the English language. In what world can we restore that sort of idea to a country as far down the road as this one? And your book is quite hopeful, really. I mean, you are very honest about the fix we're in, but you actually say that there's a possibility of restoration. Now, I've seen restoration happen before, but this is a big leap.
Yeah, it is. I don't tell people I'm hopeful, but I'm also not a pessimist.
Okay.
No, seriously, I'm a religious person, and it gives me a very particular perspective. I think we're terrible at seeing the future. I mean, we're good. We can plot the trajectory. If we plot the trajectory, we can all. I mean, you and I can see that America is finished, and it's going to take the democratic world with it. But luckily, we're terrible at seeing the future. And no, seriously, and what that means is that if you think about almost nobody foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the bursting of the housing bubble, the rise of nationalism in America and Britain in 2016, the collapse of liberalism in 2020. Almost no one saw these things coming. Certainly didn't know how they were going to happen. We were all surprised. So what that means is this: that look, we have to restore conservatism personally in our own lives, in our families, in our congregations. We have to return to a life of conservation and transmission. That's going to mean repentance, whether Christian or Jewish. It's going to mean repentance and a return to Scripture. And at the national level, I agree. I think it's at this point absurd to hope that a real conservative coalition is simply going to take power in Washington and then is going to completely change the life of the country. I think that's too much to hope for. But what I think is possible is there are still many places in America, in Europe, elsewhere. There are still many states, many places where there is a Christian majority, or at least a pro-Christian majority. People who look at what's coming. They can see what's happening, and they say, you know what? We can't fight this with just let everybody do whatever they feel like. We need to fight this woke neo-Marxist revolutionary vision. We need to fight it with a competing vision, and that competing vision is going to have to be some kind of biblical democracy, Christian democracy, conservative democracy. It's going to have to be some kind of restoration. In those states where that's still possible, it's got to be done. And what I am hoping is that all of the people are always saying, "Oh, look, it'll be like Iran of the Ayatollahs if the Christians ever take power." Now, I think I just don't think that's true. I think it's false. So what we got to do is we got to do it. Let's actually try to place a Christian public vision back in place in some of the states where it's still possible, in some countries in Europe. Let's build a coalition to do it and make sure that minorities don't feel abused by it, and that it's reasonable. And if Christian democracy deserves to replace the woke neo-Marxism that's coming, then we'll get to see it. And if it doesn't, then we'll know that too.
What would a Christian democracy look like specifically? I mean, I know the founders of America said we need this, our Constitution will only serve a religious people, but they didn't actually put the machinery forward for making a Christian government.
Well, yes and no. They were definitely very concerned that the federal government should not interfere in the very diverse practices of church and state relations in the different states, in the 13 states. And various states still had established churches, and all of them had some kind of preference for Christianity and biblical values. By the way, in the United Kingdom, I mean, this federalism was kind of sort of an imitation of Britain, where the British had the Church of England in England, right, which Anglican, obviously. And in Scotland, they had the Church of Scotland, which was Presbyterian, which is completely different. And in Ireland, the Church of Ireland. So the American founders kind of imitated this. They said each state is going to have its own arrangements in terms of church and state, which are appropriate to it. And that continued in the United States. That thought, that theory, up until 1947, when after World War II again, when the liberal Supreme Court for the first time declared separation of church and state to be a fundamental American constitutional principle and imposed it on all of the 48 American states from Washington by fiat. That, as far as I'm concerned, that's the wrong turn, and it's not. I mean, I didn't make this up. In the 1980s, Justice William Rehnquist wrote, a very, very famous dissent, I think in 1985, tracing the wrong turn in church beginning in 1947 in the Everson case, and he wrote then that the entire line of decisions has been wrongly decided and has to be overturned. I think that's basically where we are right now. That Americans simply have to return to the pre-1947 church-state circumstances, where the states get to experiment with different kind of public religion, public philosophy, and let's see what works. I think that's the way.
When I visit England, the churches are virtually empty. I had an English friend write me the other day who he actually goes to church and is an officer in his church, and he was outraged because he finally read the Gospels and found out that salvation was through Jesus Christ alone. Classic English, the churches here are flying Black Lives Matter banners. I feel like the church itself has lost its way. And yet you say in your book, you think this is actually a good time, a time that it's not a good time, but it's a good time for restoration. Why do you feel that way?
Well, because everything's in motion. I mean, it's not. It's obviously not. It's not a good time because we're watching. We're watching the countries and the traditions that we love and believe in disintegrating before our eyes. So it's not a good time. But as of 2020, I mean, we have to understand what happened in 2020 between World War II and 2020. Liberal political theory, liberal philosophy was kind of the official religion of the United States and of Europe. It was a consensus. Both major parties had different versions of it, and like I said, that lasted for 2 generations. Now, in 2020, we're seeing the collapse of liberal hegemony. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's already happened. I mean, there's still plenty of you still see anti-Marxist liberals, like some good, loyal, old school liberals who are fighting the rearguard action against the neo-Marxist takeover of all the major institutions in the United States, or most of them. But that's a small minority. I mean, what's actually happened is that conservatives have, since 2016, have turned in a direction that is a lot more nationalist and in some ways more traditionalist, and the left has gone full cultural revolution, and the liberal consensus is now down to, like, a small number of very prominent, very intelligent people at the center of the map. But they can't restore. There's not going to be any going back to the post 1960s liberalism. So when there's a contest taking place on the right to try to develop and get in position to be the main thing that is leading the charge against woke neo-Marxism. And as you mentioned, but my colleagues and I in the national conservative movement, we have our own views about how that's supposed to go. But there are all sorts of other groups, and I think we represent by far the largest. The largest voting bloc and the intuitions of the great mass of Americans and others. But what we have now is an opportunity to rethink conservatism, to put it on foundations that are appropriate for these years as opposed to for the 1960s. And if we can do that, I think we still have a good chance of being able to rally a very large number of Americans and people in other countries, forge an alliance with the remaining anti-communist liberals if they can stand us, and with some others on the right, and be able to turn this around. It's possible, but we're going to have to work really hard to do it, both in our personal lives and nationally.
The book is called Conservatism, A Rediscovery. The author is Yoram Hazony, Hazony. Yoram, I wish we could continue this for another 20 minutes. I'm out of time, but I hope next time you're in the country, you'll let us know so we can have you back. I would love to hear more.
Okay, sure, will do.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, bye.